Over the last kind of couple of decades that I've been working on it, I'm always grateful to find people who are interested in thinking about where India fits in to US foreign policy, but also are interested in this triangle, which, believe it or not, about 20 years ago when I started studying it, I was told, why are you thinking about this triangle? It's irrelevant. I don't think we'll call it that today. It's great to be with you today to talk about this triangle. I'm trained as a historian, so usually I do start by going back in part to offer context for today, and I'm going to do that today as well. I'm not going to talk too much about the history. The book that James mentioned, it has a lot more of the history. I'm going to talk about the history just to give you a little bit of context for what we are thinking about today. Now, the bottom line up front is going to be me telling you that US-India relations have changed from 25 years ago to today, and that China is a big driver of that change. That's the bottom line up front, and I'm going to spend the next, I'm going to make sure I'm on time here, the next 35, 40 minutes telling you why that's the case and how that is the case. 25 years ago, it's often forgotten today, but there were US sanctions on India. Today, the US calls India its most consequential partner. India calls the US an indispensable partner. The relationship between the two countries has never been closer. Now, as I said, what caused this shift from friction to friendship? A shift that has taken place over multiple administrations of very different political stripes in both countries. The crucial part of the answer is China. It hasn't been the only factor driving the US-India partnership. The two countries shared concerns about China's growing assertiveness has been a crucial, I would argue, even essential factor in the two countries developing the kind of partnership that they have today. So let's go back 25 years. As I said, there were sanctions in India. Why were there sanctions in India? Because India had tested nuclear weapons in 1998. The US, Europe, others had an automatic set of sanctions that went into effect. Now, even then, there was a China angle to everything that was happening. The Indian Prime Minister wrote a letter to the US President, to President Clinton at the time, and gave the justification for those nuclear tests. It says they were driven by a need for deterrence against India's nuclear neighbor, China, which had developed nuclear weapons in the 1960s. The US, on the other hand, not just imposed sanctions, the US and China issued a joint statement criticizing India's tests, much to India's annoyance. China at that time was a point of difference in the US-India relationship. Now I want you to fast forward from 1998, from that period, where you had the US and China on one side and India on the other. So fast forward 10 years to 2008. And the signs of change in the that triangle were already apparent. And I'll mention two developments. One was a historic civil nuclear deal, which was between the US and India, and it essentially helped bring India in from the cold, or India's nuclear program in from the cold. And this would happen during the Bush administration, but it crucially, the chair at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time was one Joe Biden, and it was a bipartisan deal that was put into effect on the US side with India. The second thing that had happened by 2008 was India started, after not having done so for a decade, India started acquiring military equipment from the US, and some of the most sensitive military equipment that the US only sells to allies and close partners. At that time, China was already on the back of the minds of policymakers in both the US and India, driving both those developments. And in recent years, it has been at the front of their minds. So it's not just something in more implied, it's much more explicit as a driver. Now let me give you an example using one of those military acquisitions that India started making. So India went from In 2008, $0 billion worth of acquisitions from the US. Today it's at about $25 billion. But one of the first things India purchased was C-130 strategic airlift planes. You might see some of them. There are a number of them based in Colorado. But India bought a number of them as well. And in 2013, a few years after 2008, then India had acquired these planes from the US. You see this historic landing. Now, in each of these kind of images, there's a China angle, and I'll tell you about each. That plane landing in Daulat Beg Oldi is an advanced landing ground that India has very close to the China border, up on its northern border. You guys know a little bit about altitude. You can hear it in my breath a little bit. I'm still getting used to it. That landing ground is the reason it was historic, that landing ground is at 17,000 feet. And so even for no C-130 had ever landed. But what it did is India's ability to land this capability, which it didn't have before, which it had acquired from the US, at that high altitude base, the idea was that in the event of a contingency, you started seeing India able to insert troops and equipment if it had a problem with China. Now, the second image that you see up there was in 2020, when there was such a contingency. India and China got into a military standoff. It resulted in a fatal clash, the first one in 45 years. And what you saw is, during that crisis, that C-130, instead of just kind of that was kind of a test landing, it was part of what was used to insert those troops and equipment. Other US equipment also came into play: C-17s, Apaches and Chinook helicopters, and others. But you also saw that during that 2020 crisis, and I'll talk a little bit about this more, the US actively helped India diplomatically, militarily, and with intelligence sharing. But now India and the US have also gone beyond a buyer-seller relationship. So it's not just Indian acquisition, but co-production. That image over there is a US company in a joint venture with an Indian company producing every one of the tails of those C-130s in the world is now produced in southern India. And so India has now become part of the co-production of the supply chain on the defense side, from having had no defense trade and technology relationship just a couple of decades ago with the US. Moreover, beyond acquisitions, beyond kind of co-production, you're also seeing now these C-130s help a third thing, which is interoperability between the two militaries. This recent photograph it's very tiny, but you can see a C-130 there. The bigger plane, actually, usually the C-130 is the biggest plane around, is a B-52 bomber. This is from an exercise that the US and India, multiple military services, just undertook on the eastern coast of India. And it's called Tiger Triumph. And what the acquisition of this equipment, and again, what are they? They call it an HADR, a humanitarian assistance and disaster relief exercise. And then you ask the question, what is a bomber doing, strategic bomber doing for an HADR exercise? It's not. There's a country that is on everybody's mind, and a set of contingencies on everybody's mind, and that is China. Now, we think these days of this China factor as new. That it's only in this last 20, 25 years that's really shaping and driving US-India relations. But the idea of an India-China-US triangle has existed for years. It's taken different forms, though, and I'll just briefly kind of go through them. If you saw kind of until in the early to mid-50s, you actually had China and India on one side, often kind of on the other side of the US. The US obviously had dense relations with China because it was allied with the Soviet Union. But India went through an Asia for Asians phase, saying that it wanted to actually partner with China. Then you went through a phase in the late 1950s and 60s, which is actually a lot more like today, where India's relationship with China had deteriorated very badly, and India started partnering with the US in parts to deter and balance China. You go further, or let's try this. there we go, in the 1970s and 80s, you not just see a triangle, you also see a little bit more in this, that there's been a triangle, but you've always had two other countries involved in kind of shaped how this relationship in this triangle developed. One is Pakistan, and the other was then the Soviet Union, today Russia. And what you saw in the 70s and 80s is India had aligned with the Soviet Union, in part to balance China again. China had actually, after the Nixon trip, there was a rapprochement, China, the US and Pakistan were now ranged against India and the Soviet Union. And then you have kind of the 90s where there's a little bit of everybody engaging everybody, but you still saw that period of cooperation, as I mentioned, where you had the US and China getting closer, diplomatically working together, and also both in some ways engaging with Pakistan, though both not really important partners for either country. Now, if you come to the current phase, how does this look from the US perspective? This is actually what you see today. This is the shift that I talked about, which is you have a very close India-US partnership, and this is what I'm actually going to talk about for the rest of the talk. You have an India that still has a partnership with Russia, not as important as it used to be, and problematically for India, a Russia that's getting closer to China, and China that has a long-standing relationship with Pakistan. In this current phase, how does India fit into US strategy when it's thinking about China? Now, for the US, this was the Indo-Pacific strategy, the formal Indo-Pacific strategy that was released by the Biden administration in early 2022. It got overshadowed because that was the same week the Russians invaded Ukraine. But nonetheless, what this Indo-Pacific strategy talked about is the need for the US to shape a favorable balance of power and influence in Asia, and to achieve the objective of a secure, prosperous, resilient region where countries are free to make choices. Now, it also said that the US was not willing nor able to go it alone in ensuring that objective. It needed allies and partners. Burden sharing was crucial. Now, as we all know, there's not much that the Biden and Trump administration agreed on, but this is actually something the Biden and Trump administrations have agreed on, that the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific is being challenged. There's a need for other countries to be involved. And what is the main challenge to that rules-based order in the region? It is a China that is behaving assertively. This administration has called China the pacing threat for the administration, for the US more broadly. And so what they've looked around for in terms of who to partner with, who to put in investment and resources and time with, it has been who is like-minded on China. And both the Trump and Biden administrations have found that India is one of those countries that shares some key concerns about China's behavior, but also is willing to work with the US to do something about it. And so from the US perspective, that strategic convergence with China has not just driven cooperation with India, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it has also incentivized the US and India to manage their differences, which would have otherwise kind of blown up a lot more. Now those differences are on economic issues, they're on Russia, they're on values issues. There's also on the issues that India doesn't do alliances. It doesn't really become anybody's ally. So there are differences that pop up, but the fact that there's strategic convergence on China has ensured that the US, the Biden administration, and the Trump administration before dealt with those differences very differently. What about India? Where does it stand when it comes to the US and China? A few years ago, in 2019, there was an exchange between two former officials at the time. One was General Petraeus. This was at a conference in New Delhi that was co-hosted by the Indian Foreign Ministry. This is post-retirement, General Petraeus, and the gentleman next to him on that side had just retired as India's senior-most bureaucrat in the foreign ministry. Kind of the equivalent here is either the Undersecretary of State or the Deputy Secretary of State. Little known at the time, he would go on to become, and is currently India's foreign minister. But he was not in office at the time. And there was a debate between the two, and General Petraeus said that China was, quote, the defining issue of our age, and seemingly in frustration added that countries like India have to decide. And he asked if India could indeed take a stand and choose a side. And Dr. Jaishankar retorted, India should take a stand and should take a side, our side. Now, many in India and the US interpreted that remark as suggesting that India's approach will be non-aligned, to walk a middle path and avoid taking sides in the geopolitical competition between China and the US. And that kind of interpretation is very much shaped by views of India's stance during the US-Soviet Cold War. That prism leads people to believe that when it comes to US-China competition today, there'll be a rinse and repeat of India's stand. And so you have people often saying, this is essentially what India is going to do between the US and China, kind of have an equidistant, a balanced relationship, when in reality, this is actually the case. An India that does not weigh the two countries in the same way. This is still an India that will not be a military ally for the US, but it is also not non-aligned. It will align on key interests because today, its options are not as the same as they were during US-Soviet competition. There are some similarities from India's perspective when it's thinking about the US-Soviet Cold War, now US-China competition. Long-term competition that looms between two countries with which India engages diplomatically and economically, competition that's likely to play out across multiple domains, geopolitical, economic, technological, ideological as well, as across several different regional and international platforms as well, at the UN Security Council, in Asian regional forums, etc. Also, just as US-Soviet competition did, US-China rivalry today is already shaping and will shape the regional and global environment in which India is operating. That's another similarity. And like then, because of that, India will be hoping that competition between the two superpowers does not turn into conflict, because that will adversely affect India's economic and development goals. Now, those are the similarities, but most of the elements are actually, for India, quite different, and why it will approach US-China competition very differently than it did US-Soviet competition, and why it is really driving a partnership with the US. Compared to the Cold War, today the two major competitors, US and China, and you've probably heard this from other speakers, including, I know you had Jonathan Ward come here, US and China are more intertwined and interconnected, and particularly the two economies. In some ways, the US and China are actually more interdependent on each other than either of them are with India. And this Sino-US interdependence will continue to fuel in Indian policymakers' mind this constant worry about a US-China grand bargain, or what they call a G2, that there will be a US-China condominium and it'll throw India under the bus. So that's one difference from the past. The US and Soviet Union obviously didn't have that level or nature of economic ties. Second difference is the global configuration of power. Lots more major and middle powers in the world, particularly in Asia. And while many of these powers, including India, might be more like-minded with the US, some are even allies of the US, they also have ties with China as well. And some of them do not want to actually join either bloc. This has implications for India, this set of major and middle powers, because it allows and gives India options as it tries to pursue its foreign policy diversification strategy that allows it to maintain its freedom of action. So India tries to like multiple partnerships because it gives India multiple options, and it avoids overdependence on one partner. And so with all these powers today, India has a lot more options for partnerships beyond the US and China. The other thing that is different for India today is its own power and position are different. Delhi did play an active role in Asia in the first half of the Cold War, the first decade and a half of the Cold War, but there was a sense it was punching above its weight. Today, India is a state that has one of the largest militaries in the world. It has nuclear weapons, a thriving space program, an economy that is larger than 3 of the permanent 5 of the UN Security Council, and it has become an aid donor from being an aid recipient. It also has membership in a number of key institutions. And is being actively sought out by many countries as a partner. And what this does is, this position gives India much more space. But it also means, because India is involved in all these global and regional fora, it won't allow India to kind of stay aloof from key discussions and debates. So another reason it's not going to be able to be a fence sitter when it comes to the US and China competition. Another key difference is that the primary theater of competition in this case today is going to be Asia, which is on India's doorstep. It's not going to be Europe as it was in the Cold War. At least that was the primary theater. It wasn't like they weren't spillover into Asia, but the primary theater was in Asia. Another difference, the Russia factor, or the Moscow factor, so to speak. During that period, during the Cold War, India found a willing partner in Moscow when it wanted to balance and deter China when Sino-Soviet relations were bad. Today, Russia's relationship with China is very close. And that has become a problem for India, because India used to see Russia as part of its balancing strategy against China. Now with Russia and China close, that complicates India's options. It even creates problems as India's relationship with China has deteriorated. And that brings me to the greatest difference today than in the past, which is why India won't fence it between the US and China, which is today you see kind of India and India's relationships with the 2 superpower competitors being very different than they were in the past. During the Cold War, you had an India that maintained ties with both Washington and Moscow. Delhi had differences with both of them, but there were no fundamental disputes or conflicts of interest. Today, the nature and extent of India's relationships with the US and China are very different. Whether you look at the diplomatic sphere, the defense and security sphere, economic, technology, energy domains, people-to-people domains as well. And so today, not only is it not just very different relationships, but an even bigger problem. The most significant difference for India as it looks at US-China competition is that it has a major problem with one of the 2 competitors. On the one side, there's China, which alone and in conjunction with Pakistan is India's most significant external strategic challenge. And on the other side, you have the US, one of India's closest partners. Also, the US and India have differences, but not fundamental disputes. It's not the case with India-China relations. India has seen China as a geopolitical challenge since the 1950s, alone, and as I said, along with Pakistan. While the degree of that threat perception has varied over time, this has largely been one of the most consistent elements of Indian foreign and security policy making. At the heart of India's concerns about competition with China lies the border dispute. They have the longest undemarcated border in the world. They had, particularly between 1988 and 2013, set up over a 25-year period to be able to actually pursue economic ties, India and China, after having fought a war over this border in 1962. By the 80s, they decided we need to grow and develop together. They start in a 25-year period. They reach a series of agreements with elaborate protocols, but the fundamental thing, there was no country was going to take unilateral steps or use force to change the status quo at the border. So essentially, they were freezing it while they tried to resolve it. So they were going to manage the border dispute and eventually resolve it. But after Xi Jinping comes to office, India starts noticing that after peace and calm at the border, there are a number of incursions that start happening from the PLA. They happen in 2013, in 2014, in 2017 at the India-Bhutan-China tri-junction. But nonetheless, India continued to engage with China. They took a competitive engagement approach. China was India's largest trading partner, but they were going to sort out and compete on some of the other issues. Today, however, another border standoff, the one I mentioned that started in 2020, has led to India and China going from competitive engagement to armed coexistence. And this is because this recent crisis, the standoff which continues to this day, happened in multiple locations across their border. As I said, it was the first fatal clash in 45 years. And it has brought, because it's continued now for about 4 years, and it's ongoing, it has brought the China-India relationship to the lowest point since the two countries fought that war in '62. And what this boundary crisis in 2022, plus China's handling and lack of transparency of COVID, it was like a 1-2 punch in the India-China relationship. What it did, these two things did, is they hardened Indian views of China. The Indian government went from saying, look, we can trust but verify, to take an attitude of saying, we cannot trust that China won't violate these boundary agreements again, and that it won't take further steps to acquire additional territory at the border. And so you've seen an India-China relationship that has changed and led to, for example, in domestic policy in India, India imposing restrictions and extra scrutiny on a range of Chinese activities, including in the economic, technology, telecommunications, no Huawei in India, no TikTok in India spaces, but even in the kind of public diplomacy and education spaces. And it's made a difference in terms of India's foreign policy stance, where it has doubled down on relationships with countries that help it balance China. Now, I'm going to kind of speed through this next set of differences, just because I want to get to the US section and how the US fits into this triangle for India. But just to say that beyond the border disputes, and I'm happy to talk about any one of these in greater detail if you'd like during Q&A, India has a range of bilateral, regional, global differences. With China, there's a river water sharing dispute. Tibet, the presence of the Dalai Lama and several several hundred thousand Tibetan refugees in India. Their economic ties were going to be kind of the panacea in many people's minds. They were going to alleviate political frictions. Actually, economic ties, because India sees them, much like we do here, as having been asymmetric, unbalanced, large trade deficit, little market access in China. It's actually ended up being a friction point as well. You've also seen on the regional side a couple of differences. The China-Pakistan relationship, which is quite deep, but goes back, it has been getting deeper since the 1960s. India sees China as having enabled Pakistan's conventional nuclear and missile capabilities. And now, as part of the Belt and Road initiatives of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, now also deepening in the economic space. And India is now broadly concerned about China's growing economic footprint in all of its neighbors. So not just, other than Bhutan, not just Pakistan. India's concerned, yes, about the fiscal impact, the debt burdens this is putting on India's neighbors, but it's also concerned about the strategic and political influence that China is gaining in all its neighbors: Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, Maldives, Afghanistan. India is concerned about what this is doing to their choices, not just about India, but vis-a-vis the US as well. China has intervened sometimes to, for instance, ensure that a US-Nepal agreement hasn't gone through, and India has helped facilitate that eventually going through, but concerned about these influences. There's also a set of regional differences that are broader. India thinks China wants a unipolar Asia dominated by Beijing, where it sets the terms. India wants to see a multipolar Asia. India wants to see more US in the Indo-Pacific. China wants to see less US and says there should be an Asia for Asians mode. India also sees not just at its border, but in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and in other spaces, India expressing concern about China's willingness to make unilateral changes in the status quo. Deeply concerned about that, particularly kind of using force. Globally, India thinks that China essentially wants to hinder India's rise, and that it wants to keep it out of various institutions. And as I said, overarching all this is a lack of trust in China's commitments and a lack of trust that China will not do what it's done before at the India-China border. Underlying all of this, which has become a big problem for India, is the capabilities gap between China and India. 30 years ago, India and China had economies the same size. Today, China's economy is over 5 times that of India. Its defense budget is over 3 times that of India. And so for India, the ultimate problem is, as it looks at all these concerns, is that unlike the Cold War, India is faced with the fact that when it comes to Sino-US competition and China-US competition, one of the 2 major competitors is its main rival. And India's choices aren't what they were during the Cold War. It cannot be non-aligned, that's not feasible. But it will not sign alliances. It's not desirable for India, and frankly, we're not offering India an alliance. So what is the answer? It lies in India's own history, which is alignment, an option between non-alignment and alliance. And India has done this before, once with the US, once with the Soviet Union. Alignment doesn't mean India and the US will agree on everything. But this interest-based alignment recognizes that India has concerns with China that are not going to go away. And it recognizes that with China, that China-India massive capabilities gap being what it is, India needs partners. And those partners are going to include some Indo-Pacific partners like Japan, Australia, South Korea, Southeast Asian countries, some European partners like France, Germany, the UK, the EU more broadly, and even Russia. But the country that is most like-minded with India when it comes to China and has the greatest ability in India's mind to do something about the challenge that China poses is the US. And so what you see today is an India that sees China as a challenge and a US that sees China as a challenge. Both can't and don't want to deal with the challenge on their own. India and the US see each other as part of the solution to their China problem. And they see it in different ways. For India, it's both about enabling India's capability to deal with this China problem, but also helping maintain, the US helps maintain a balance of power in the region. Today, you see the US also see India as being helpful vis-a-vis China in these different ways. And so what that has meant is deeper ties between the 2 countries across the board. Now, in the interest of time, I'm actually going to cut my presentation short considerably, but I do want to kind of give you a sense, particularly of some of how China has driven, this convergence on China and how it's the kind of cooperation it has led to. It has led to cooperation in a few different ways. You've seen kind of diplomatic cooperation, not just bilateral, but in regional and economic institutions where both countries are actually sometimes engaging and cooperating bilaterally, but also with other allies and partners to try to, for instance, compete for the leadership of certain organizations, to ensure certain principles are enshrined when China is trying to kind of argue the opposite. You're also seeing economic ties partly driven by the China challenge. As the US is seeking to diversify, build more resilient supply chains, I'll give you a couple of instances. The US has a development finance institution called the Development Finance Corporation. And you've seen 2 large projects, the DFC financing 2 large projects to help diversify the solar energy supply chain in India. So they've given a financing to an American company with setting up a solar power manufacturing facility in India and an Indian company. You've also seen Apple, and you'll start to see your iPhones, it's saying assembled in India very soon. Again, diversifying supply chain because it's part of a China +1 strategy. Technologically, you've seen India in the cyber, in the space domain, really deepen ties. Also in the defense and security domains across a wide range of issues. I was going to talk a little bit about defense cooperation, but I'm going to actually skip through. We can come back. I do want to mention this. Beyond bilaterally, and I'm going to take 2 to 3, or I'll skip through in about 4 minutes. But the reason I want to mention it is you've seen kind of bilaterally India engage and China driving that cooperation, as I said, diplomatically, economically, defense and security, technology, and even in the energy space. But India and the US, and this is really different for India and the US, they're also cooperating with other partners. You went in Asia that the US had a hub and spoke model. US at the center, bilateral alliances with Japan, with Korea, with others. We've now moved to a network. Think of a spider web, where you have various nodes and allies and partners engaging with each other, but also these kind of interest-based or issue-based coalitions. The one at the center, which India prioritizes a fair bit, is the Quad, with the US, Australia, India, and Japan. But now you're seeing several ones, not just in kind of Asia, but also India and the US working together in the Middle East as well. And you're also seeing India and the US, for example, working in third countries together, and certain things that India is doing that are benefiting US goals in the Indo-Pacific. You're seeing India now deepening ties with Southeast Asia. The Indian Foreign Minister was just in the Philippines, kind of endorsing their call for China to respect the tribunal judgment on the South China Sea. You've seen India kind of engage in Africa. You've also seen India now deepen its ties with many US partners in the Middle East. And you've seen, this is at the G20 meeting on the sidelines was a meeting with Brazil, South Africa, India, the US, and the World Bank, which is India offering to be a bridge between the West or the US and the global South, developing countries these days, and say, look, if we don't be that, we aren't that bridge, the voice of the global South will be China. So even that kind of bridging role that India is playing has a China angle to it. Similarly, the US also has a broader importance for India, where it has become one of India's largest partners. So it is about China, yes, but it is about, there are a lot of other things that the US does that are of use to India, just like some of India's other relationships are of use to the US. Finally, I'm going to just kind of talk, and like I said, happy to talk about the defense and security partnership more briefly. I do want to talk a little bit about, before I wrap up, about some of the limits of alignment, both on the China issue, but more broadly. There are some differences that the US and India have on China. Threat prioritization. For India, the primary contingency that it will worry about will be its own border problem. For the US, it's going to be a contingency in Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait. It's going to be a contingency in the South China Sea. And so sometimes you hear this discussion, what will India do in the event of a Taiwan contingency? What kind of role will it play? Is it really on our side? And happy to address that question in Q&A, but this kind of divergence of which contingency is going to be prioritized, which theater is going to be prioritized, does come up. You also see an issue where India continues to see Russia as a part of the solution to its China problem. We see Russia as part of the problem to our China problem. There's also this, both India and the US are putting in place economic restrictions to deal with China. This is also starting to affect India and the US. You're seeing this with this Nippon Steel deal, so it's not just India, where some of the restrictions we're putting in place, because we've become more protectionist here, is going to affect our ability. It's also going to affect our partners, in this case Japan, but there are many instances where, for example, India was also hit by tariffs that were supposed to be directed towards China. And then there's this kind of constant concern that both plays out in India and the US. Is the other side really going to be committed to the region? Is it really going to play the role we want it to? And then finally, a difference is India continues to, it's not hedging between the US and China. India is hedging against uncertainty about the US. What will the next administration do about China? We don't know. There's also hedging against overdependence on the US because it wants to maintain its strategic autonomy. And I kind of will end with that is beyond kind of the China difference, there are a range of differences that you can put in different slots between the US and India that will play out. Strategic autonomy is one of them. But will these differences set a limit or not? It depends. So the way I structure it is, in India-US relations, it is going to depend on the level of openness within the countries, politically. How open, how strong are the US and India going to be as democracies? How cohesive are the two countries going to be internally? How will that affect their ability to be effective global and regional partners to each other? Economically, can India be more open, provide a better business environment for companies from here that are looking for alternatives to China? How open will the US be on trade and immigration as countries like India try to diversify? And strategically, finally, the big question is, an India that is strategically autonomous, what is that limit of that alignment? And for us, the big question, not only are we going to stay committed to the Indo-Pacific, but can we find a way, we're used to dealing with allies, to deal with a country that doesn't do alliances? And I'll stop there. I'm done, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Madan. That was comprehensive and detailed and very interesting. So my name is Ritvik Ghosh. I'm at the University of Denver. I'm here to ask some questions to Dr. Madan. When I was growing up in India and during, later on in the 2000s, there was a great sense of awe of China. And people would visit China and come back telling stories about these incredible train systems and highways and how Shanghai looks like New York. Do you sense that there is a change in the popular imagination within India about what China is? And you mentioned this kind of lack of trust. Is that at the leadership level? Has that percolated down to the population? And in the US, for example, you have somewhat of a bipartisan consensus around China. But when it comes to actual policies, whether it is towards corn exports, or whether it's towards a technology company, then the cleavage is starting to appear. So is there, what's the general population in India's positioning towards China? And that could be quite plural. And how are political parties representing the different positions toward China?
It's a great question, and I'll actually start with the last first, which is that there are differences within India on approaching China, though not as stark, I think, as they are here. But the differences aren't on a party line basis. If anything, there's currently an election campaign going on. The opposition is criticizing Prime Minister Modi for not being tough enough. And that's the center-left opposition. So it's kind of the reverse of here. And so you're seeing the differences that do come up are, for instance, sometimes there are certain businesses who import a lot of intermediate equipment. They have a problem with some of the economic restrictions and saying, look, we need to import more from China, so some of these restrictions and tariffs need to be removed. So you do see some differences within kind of the space, but doesn't tend to be on a kind of a party-wide basis. There's also a school of thought that actually doesn't like the way this triangle is shaping up. And there's a horseshoe effect, where there are people on the left and people on the right who think India is getting too close to the US. So it's not about China. They have no love lost for China. But they do think India is getting too close to the US as a result of those problems with China. So part of their solution is, well, maybe we should make up with China or find a way to do a deal with China. Now that, you can't clap with one hand, so that requires China to come on board. There have been some discussions of whether or not, and this is where I segue into your question about the public, there's been some indications that much like the US and Australia, there are feelers out from India to China to see, can they find a way to stabilize the relationship, set a floor? So it's not about suddenly becoming friends again, but at least setting a floor to the relationship. The Modi government has no interest in a border crisis getting worse. And so I think what you have is a situation where, especially before an election campaign, the elections start in April, there is even a prime minister like Prime Minister Modi, who is considered strong in national security. He is sensitive about the kind of visual of India potentially negotiating with China on, given that the border standoff taken place, because they think that the public will actually care about it. Having said that, it's not that suddenly you've seen the Indian public not buy Chinese phones. They're still buying, like us, still buying a lot of Chinese products because they're cheaper often. But you are seeing on a kind of public level a lot more kind of anti-China language. And to some extent, this wasn't just the border crisis. It had, as I said, it was COVID as well, and the Chinese lack of transparency about COVID, I think, had a lot of people were affected by COVID in India, and I think that affected things as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about the different the bad guys in movies, and I haven't seen an Indian movie with a Chinese bad guy quite as yet. But maybe that's to come in the future.
There were, and whenever you kind of see, sometimes you find out about this. I think there have been a couple of kind of smaller movies, but you find out about it because the Global Times starts kind of yelling about it and saying, India's being, or the Indian public is being anti-China. There is an interesting kind of story, even though for Hollywood, for example, the China market was very crucial. There's a quota system, they got a certain number. Bollywood movies actually did quite well. Not that many got released, but they did really well in China, some of them. And so there was, for a while, this, especially before the border crisis, there was this idea that, one way India could get market access was because the Chinese public actually really liked Indian movies. But you've seen even that kind of go away in that sense. But nonetheless, there was a talk about, are there no kind of Chinese villains because Bollywood's making money? I think that's not the case anymore. But
let me ask you a little bit more about the strategic partnerships. I have learned so much about shapes from this presentation. There is triangles, there are quadrilaterals. Do all alliances, as you suggest, we need to think about, or rather alignments, do all alignments for India's counter-positioning to China, are they all through the US? Or are there some alignments that could be potentially make the US nervous about how India is trying to counter China? And, there was the Modi government, I think in 2014, launched a very similar to the USA Act East policy. Looking towards Southeast Asia for partnerships, I think Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia. So what other shapes can we see, and does US have to be one node in every one of these?
No, I actually think not just for India. I think, that's why I said think about a spider web, which is now beyond the shapes. And this is kind of mixing designs, but it's a lot more complex, and there are a lot more connections between nodes. There really isn't kind of everything revolving. It's not like a solar system that everything's revolving around the US, particularly for the US, but I think it's also the case with a number of other countries. So I'll give you an example of some Indian alignments that actually the US quite likes and actually even facilitated. Those include kind of with many US allies. Some of India's closest partners today are Australia, Japan, France. As I said earlier, kind of the UK, South Korea kind of partners as well. Philippines is quite new. India's traditional partnerships in Southeast Asia were with Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, to some extent with Myanmar as well. But now Philippines has become closer partners. And this is where the complexity comes in, because those are the alignments that the US likes. And they're also taking place not just in bilaterals, but the US, India, others, everybody's doing these. The new thing are minilaterals, these interest-based coalitions. You find a set of issues that you agree on and you work together on that. You might not work together on other things. But the complexity of this is, so with the Philippines, what is India doing? One of the things India is doing is it's selling Philippines to be able to defend itself against the Chinese in part, some missiles. Those missiles were co-developed and co-produced by India and Russia. And that is the alignment that India still sees with kind of vis-a-vis China that the US doesn't like as much. It tolerates, it accepts that India is going to be India, and India will not take sides between the West and Russia. But even that has a China element to it, which is, it's for India, even now, so the Russians used to, if you look at the last 10-year period, the Russians used to, in that first 5 years, India's military imports of military equipment, about over 70% of that still came from Russia. Now it's down to about 40% in the last 5 years. So India's already been diversifying its military supply, but the Russians still remain a large provider of defense equipment. And India's existing military equipment still has a lot of Soviet and Russian components and parts to it. So for India's military readiness against China, that Russia relationship is crucial. And what India doesn't want is in the next India-China crisis, Russia goes from neutral to taking China's side. That suddenly becomes a problem for India. And I think this is a difference that the US and India have managed, because the US understands that there are reasons, including China-related ones, that India engages with Russia and will continue to do so.
But is there also a sense that the theater of the India-China conflict plays out in the Himalayan border regions? Is there an expectation, or is there signs already of that playing out in the Indian Ocean or in the Southeast Asian, South China Sea, where India is trying to also then create some naval dominance, and does the US play a role in that?
So I think the Indian Ocean, definitely, this has been a growing concern for India. People used to make fun of India when some analysts used to say there's going to be a string of pearls around India, which is the Chinese PLAN having naval access to bases. So if not actual bases, but access to bases. And everybody used to say, no, never going to happen. And then the Chinese set up a base in Djibouti. So for India, kind of that Indian Ocean, you'll find Indian policymakers, one of them was giving testimony to India's External Affairs Committee in Parliament, said, look, and this was just after 2017, the Chinese said they were never going to set up bases abroad. They were never going to send troops abroad, because that's what the US does. It's a Cold War mentality. Ours is a base in Djibouti, which when India is thinking about it, is not a base in Africa, it's a base on the Indian Ocean. And so what India is concerned about is that, I think the Indian Navy is very realistic. China is going to be in the Indian Ocean, because its trade and supply routes, including for energy, go through it. But the challenge is, how is China going to behave in the Indian Ocean? And one former Indian Navy chief said, what we're concerned about is China will behave in the Indian Ocean the way it's behaving in the South China Sea and elsewhere. Not just not following the rules of the road, not just putting pressure on countries to give it base access, but also in terms of things like its maritime militia, its fisheries, there are Chinese surveillance vessels looking for critical minerals in the deep sea. That's the big concern, and where the US is helping is including by capabilities, but the US and India do a lot in the naval space bilaterally, but the Quad also does a fair bit in this domain.
Mm-hmm. So I have many, many more questions, and I'll keep asking them, but I want you to start thinking. I have one more question I'll ask now, but please start, ruminating and getting some questions ready to ask Dr. Madan. I believe when Reverend Martin Luther King spoke of India, he said that, to other countries I go as a tourist, to India I go as a pilgrim, suggesting at that time the kind of moral power of Indian leadership, from the legacy of Mahatma Gandhi. Today things look a little bit different. How would, my question is really, to what extent does that matter to the US-India alliance? There are democracy indicators that have been downranking India. The corruption perceptions index puts India at something like 50 or 60, far below Cuba, which is kind of strange to me, but it is what it is, and there are signs of democratic backsliding. So to what extent does the kind of moral status of India as a peaceful country, as a democracy, are they in question? And if so, or maybe in the perceptions sense, does that matter to the US-India alliance?
So I think for me, that kind of whole set of values question is the force multiplier in the relationship. It's a certain something that adds a difference. So alone, it has not. If democracy was the true driver in US-India relations, the US and India would not have had a Cold War, most of the Cold War, a very estranged experience, other than a brief period in the 50s and 60s. So it's not, I wouldn't say democracy has been the key. The fact that the two countries are democracies has been the key driver. But for example, why is that, one question Chinese analysts often ask is, why is the US not worried about India's rise? Is because it is considered part of that kind of whole democratic peace theory that it will be a rule following. If you follow rules at home, you follow rules abroad. What you are at home, you will be abroad. And so there's this, it is US policy to support India's rise, because the idea is that a strong India will be good, whether or not it did anything with the US. A strong India alone would be good for the balance of power in Asia, right? But that's policy partly because we don't see India as going to be externally aggressive, because it's seen as going to follow the rules of the road. I think another way kind of democracy ends up being a kind of a force multiplier is there's a level of transparency about decision-making in democracies that you, even when there are differences, you're not sitting there wondering, what is that country going to do? What are their intentions towards us? These are publicly discussed and debated. There's also the aspect that for countries that are a country like India that's incredibly diverse, and I would say that's true here. The US also got downgraded on some of those indices, right? When you have diverse countries, if that diversity is not managed, and democracy's liberalism is a way of managing diversity, it's not just the values reasons why democracy is kind of a special something in the US-India relationship. It is also because, from a very strategic perspective, if you are not cohesive at home, you're going to spend time and resources on internal security challenges that result in not being able to manage diversity, rather than on external security challenges. And so to me, and that's going to be true on the economic and technology side as well, right? If the US is thinking about India as an economic and technologically more trusted partner, it's partly trusted because it is a democracy. And so to me, it is that kind of across all these range, and we didn't even talk about people-to-people ties in the diaspora, but it's the thing that cuts across. So to me, countries, and I would say both of our countries, this will be a less effective relationship if, even strategically, forget the value side, if we are not effective at managing our diversity at home.
All right. We have some questions, and I see there's a question over there. Maybe you can pass the mic there. And
right at this moment, I think India is a terrible partner for the US. And I want you to explain to me, based on the next question I'm going to ask, why I am wrong. What percentage of Russian oil is purchased by India, and what percentage of Indians' import of oil and oil products are purchased by India?
So I actually think there are reasons to look at India's approach to Russia and say India should have been louder in condemnation. Having said that, I actually think it's not the oil issue that is what makes India a bad partner. And I'm going to break down the energy issue of it. And it's mostly an oil issue because India doesn't really import natural gas. It is true that before 2022, India imported about 2% of India's imports of oil, and India imports about 85% of the oil it consumes. 2% used to come, meager amounts came from Russia. It is currently about 30% of India's oil imports. What's happening with that oil? It's being refined. Guess where it's going? Guess who's buying it? Europe. Guess who drove up the prices of India's imports from India's traditional partners in Africa and West Asia or Middle East? The Europeans started buying. So India is very price sensitive. You see this month to month. When Russian oil prices go up, India stops purchasing them from them. Why has the Biden administration not sanctioned oil? Because oil companies, including American oil companies and other energy experts, have told the Biden administration, if you sanction Russian oil, that's taking a lot of oil off the market. It's going to affect our prices. And that's not just an economic thing. These decisions, some of them were made before the midterms. So we can look at India, but I think as the West, Europe needs to ask, why are they still importing oil that they know is coming from, that is being refined? We should ask, then why aren't we importing? India has also increased its imports of American oil as a result, because it's price sensitive. Now, the Indian argument is, look, we're still a developing country, and we have to ensure that these millions of people have access to affordable energy. That's part of their energy security. So they're going to get oil from wherever it is cheapest. We can take the attitude that I do think we need to look at our own purchases, and oil imports aren't sanctioned, but nonetheless, we can also just more broadly take the attitude that any country that does anything with Russia, we won't talk. We won't have any partners. Because the French are still doing business with the Russians. The Brits are still doing business. Do you know how many Russian billionaires there are in London? The Russians almost poisoned an entire British town. And the British didn't sanction them more. I mean, they did put some place. So I think one of the things that I like about the way the US has approached the world is moving away from a with us or against us attitude. For us right now, our primary, if we're saying our pacing challenge is China, but we're also got a whole other set of issues that are to do with economics and technology beyond China, that you need partners that will not always agree with you. I would rather take that India's Russia relationship in another 5 years, partly thanks to Putin's boneheaded decision, will already be a weaker relationship than it is today. So I want to focus on that long-term trend. I don't want to sanction India today, take it out of a partnership option. And it won't just be India, it'll be others as well. So is this going to be a partnership where there's agreement all the time? No. There are going to be a lot of learning, a lot of differences on things like Russia. But if we start saying that, going back to a with us against us, there are very few partners we will have.
If you're interested to know how many Russian billionaires are in London, I'll direct you to Bill Browder's presentation here in Vail from July. You can find that on our website.
Wonderful discussion, so thank you for this. I do business with India for a period of time and continue to do so in building a company there. And you said India's autonomy, and I'm curious if a better word is actually ambition. And if you jump ahead to 2080, I think India is very pragmatic. Like, they don't see the US as bigger than them. Actually, the US in the solar system is moving to the outer part of the solar system. And I'm just curious if you see the same thing, that it's ambition, it's pragmatic. If we make money on importing oil from Russia and selling it to Europe and it improves our population, they will do it. Like, is that a fair assessment or a misread from?
You know, I think one of the things that, I think that's a India does act on its interests. And I think one of the things, partly because, at least rhetorically, there was an emphasis, particularly abroad, that India took a moral stance. And on certain things it did, on apartheid South Africa, on the junta coming in Burma in the 90s and things like that. But there's a very consistent streak in India of an interest-based strategy. The only reason it shocks us because most countries do that. We do too. Let's look around at some of our not-so-great partners around the world. It's just, I think, surprising sometimes because we have this idea of India that is more idealistic because MLK, goes on his pilgrimage there. So we think of a Gandhi in India, but even Nehru used force. So it was contemporaries. We think about that aspect. So I think we will continue to see this, an India that will act in its own interests, an India that sees itself as a re-emerging power. 250 years ago, India contributed 25% of the world's GDP. Colonialism had a certain impact. India is trying to reverse it. Today, Indian private sector companies are some of the largest employers in the UK. So, there's been a little bit of a role reversal, but it is incredibly it's an aspirational country that when it thinks about its goals, its security, like any other country, its prosperity, again, like any other, and a technological transformation. But there are two other things that India puts, I think, in that goals bracket. One is rightful place on the world stage. And I don't even think they want 2080. It's now, right? And the fourth thing is strategic autonomy, self-reliance, call it what you will, that's India's version of not isolation, not equidistant relationship, freedom of action. This is a bit of a post-colonial sentiment playing out here, but wanting to be able to make decisions in a context where it will have partnerships, but wants to be able to make decisions for its own interests.
Dr. Ghosh, does that align with your research?
I was going to ask you a follow-up question to that. The China-US economic trade partnership has been very productive for the US in terms of having almost of our clothes might be manufactured in China, our phones might be manufactured in China. The cooling of that relationship, is that seen by India as an opportunity to fill the China gap, and is India positioned to do that?
Great question, and I will say just before that, this is why I sometimes think people will always say sometimes there's this monolithic view, and there used to be this case that China is kind of 10 foot tall, plays 9-dimensional chess, strategic. To me, an interest-based acting India would have been a country that had China not pressed it at the border and in other places. India might have sat that one out and said, we don't want to just benefit from the US trying to diversify or European, but from both countries, that India would have tried to actually replay the Cold War. Now what India is doing is, yes, it is very actively, and sometimes more subtly. So you will have Indian officials go to chambers of commerce and say, you guys should be, you guys should be supporting democratic engines of growth. They won't say, we mean, China's not, but it's a very active way. Another reason why I think, democracy matters, it is part of the pitch that India is making to companies that are trying to, but there is like a kind of anybody who has a China +1 strategy come to India. I think there is also, though, and I think this is necessary, I don't think India should be making a pitch just on a China +1 basis. It should be making a pitch on the basis of India in its own right should make the case for being where companies invest. And I think the answer to, is it going to be able to do it? I think you've seen companies like Apple, Tesla's looking into India and others, but I think for it to be a lot more, there needs to be much more creating of a favorable business environment. And I think there are steps, we'll see if we see them in the next few years. Because I think there's what a lot of economists have tried to say is, look, this window of opportunity for India won't stay open forever. And why the urgency isn't just, from a strategic perspective for us to find alternatives, but for India itself. But it's also, India has an incredibly large young population. And those, that's a demographic dividend if you can harness them. Without jobs, without kind of more investment from foreign investment, from domestic investment, that demographic dividend becomes a demographic disaster pretty quickly. The last thing you need is young, educated men without jobs in large numbers. That has never been a good recipe for stability around the world.
So, China, following up from that, the three countries, US, India, China, right now, juxtaposition of economic wealth is getting more and more extreme. The gap is growing in all three countries. That's a similarity, right? And although GDP is up in all three countries, the middle class is feeling worse. And the young people in particular are feeling less hopeful. I don't know how the figures play out in that, but definitely it's a local sentiment, I think, across the three countries, less so probably in India than in China and the US. As the middle class feels itself sliding, how will that play out in this triangle?
So, it's quite interesting. I think in some ways, we're living through an age of grievance. If you look at politics around the world, we look here, we look at Britain and Brexit, but that grievance is playing out different, middle class has certain grievances, others it plays out in different, in economic ways and kind of on immigration and what you see is in the West, that grievance is about how we feel we have also lost something or not got something from this recent period. China and India also have grievance. It's about what they lost 250 years ago. And till recently, when China's facing economic headwinds, you actually saw similarly in China and India, actually, that grievance actually now playing into a much more confident role. Whereas on our side, a lot of declinist talk, etc. But you see this, I think, I haven't been back to China for years. I think I was last there in 2016. I will tell you, in India, I don't get that sense of despair. When I go, actually, the thing that strikes me is how aspirational young Indians are. The big challenge for the government, for companies, for others, is to facilitate pathways for that aspiration to actually become achievement. And that is really something that I find that is different when I go, and especially when I come back. There is growing inequality, though. There's no doubt about this. You see this, you probably, a number of you saw kind of reports of this big Indian pre-wedding. It wasn't even a wedding. To some extent, you didn't see actually a lot of complaining in India because there's that aspirational that, okay, we want that too. But I do, and the other thing that has helped is governments have created social safety nets there. So now that's not, you don't want that forever. But in terms of facilitating overall. So I think there is kind of that sense. I think we're feeling it in a different way than I think in India, where the challenge is to actually ensure that more people are benefiting. And so, one of the things that heartens me is some of these companies that are going, because India has a very low female workforce participation rate. It's actually been falling, which is historically an anomaly. But some of these new companies that are going in manufacturing, they're hiring a lot of women. And to me, that's what, so it's not just about kind of, age or class, it's even things like gender, where that disparity, I think, across the board is something that is going to be a challenge for India in a way that I think is different from what we are grappling with here.
Thank you both for coming to speak with us. I have a massive hypothetical for you. It's 2025. I'm a third-party candidate, and I got elected president. And here are the members of my cabinet and members of Congress, and we've all gathered to hear this Brookings Institute scholar tell us the two most important policy challenges for India, the two things we should do, and the two things we should not do. And so all of my decision makers are here, ready for your advice.
What a question.
Sometimes it's easier to do things not to do, which is accept India. Don't expect India to be America. Take India for what it is. And second, not just with India, but with other partners, don't take a with us or against us attitude. It goes nowhere. I'll give you a third, which is kind of both what you should do and shouldn't do. Keep expectations realistic about what India is going to do. India is not going to be a US ally. It will not be like the UK. It will not be like even France, though think of it as a kind of like France and Israel, which is difficult partners and allies. Those are kind of in the don't. In the do, which is, given that you are a third-party candidate and you might have a very diverse cabinet, is try to keep the relationship as bipartisan as possible. There are not many things that people agree on in DC. It's not across the board. There are differences, whether on Russia. You're not the only one who thinks that India's relationship with Russia is very problematic. Whether on some of the concerns about democratic backsliding in India, whether about the concern about religious freedom issues, whether about others, there are differences on trade. But at the same time, there is a broad bipartisan support on India. So I would say, number one, actually try to keep it, keep it in that territory. The second thing I would say, this sounds kind of, go visit. Put it on your list of countries to visit, because it's, as much as all of us can sit and talk about it, there's nothing like, and people say that about China as well, and I think that's true, is countries, I think, is just the sheer diversity you see there, and what it takes. And so it is sometimes a cacophony, and not a view, but I personally like countries where there's cacophony, because that means you get to have differences.
Dr. Ghosh, would you add anything to either list?
I mentioned one very important cultural part of India, which was the movie industry. There is a second one. Anybody wants to guess what that is? What's a very important cultural part of India? Food, yes.
Music.
I was hoping somebody says cricket.
Cricket.
And I bring that up because the next Cricket World Cup is happening in the United States.
Yeah.
At least a part of it is happening in a few months. So go visit some of those games is what I'd suggest.
Great addition.
Yeah, I'd like to see Pakistan, India play cricket.
They're playing in New York. It was sold out in the
Is it really?
Yeah.
How fascinating. The one country you did not mention, and maybe even a region, which is in your neighborhood in India, and that's Iran and the Middle East. Is India aligned with the U.S. in terms of sanctions and its attitude towards Iran? What role should it play in the Middle East?
So a couple of issues there. One, India generally does not like non-UN sanctions. So there's an Indian view on sanctions in general, because it has been sanctioned itself, it does not particularly like sanctions in an approach. They particularly think secondary sanctions, which is what it faces in terms of some of these issues to do with Iran and Venezuela that affect it, even though it's got nothing to do with India. Is a problem. But India complies with sanctions on both. It's not importing Venezuelan or Iranian oil. That was another problem when the Russia issue came up, which is, we're not buying oil from Iran, we're not buying oil from Venezuela, now you're taking Russia off the map. But there's actually very interesting developments happening with India and the Middle East in the last few years, which has partly been actually a result of oil prices, weirdly, that have opened up a lot of space, but also because the Modi government has been pretty forward-leaning with Israel, but also with the Gulf Arab states in particular. India has traditionally had kind of think of it as a three-legged stool, a relationship with Israel, maintain a relationship with the Gulf Arab states, and maintain a relationship with Iran. Because for different reasons, those countries, India had to maintain a relationship. With the Gulf Arab states and Iran, India, because it was such a large importer of oil, it needed to maintain those ties. With the Gulf Arab states, millions of Indians work there, so we had to think about their safety and security. But also there's a religious dimension. India has one of the largest, with Iran, India has one of the largest Shia populations in the world, either the second or third largest. It also has a very large, there are about 150 million Muslims, most of them Sunni. So there was that kind of both religious but also historic, they're all trading relationships. The rupee was currency in some of these Gulf Arab states, till not so long ago actually. And so there were these historic ties and others, so they've kept these relationships. But at the same time, what's changed now is both in India has changed. These countries want to partner India. They see India now as a market. So now they're not just thinking about India as oil prices made a difference, because suddenly the Saudis, the Qataris, the Kuwaitis and others are thinking we need to diversify our revenue sources, but also our oil markets. Because the US is, thanks to the shale revolution and others, the US and others are not looking. Plus, with clean energy, in the long term, we need to look at other markets. So India became important to them. Suddenly, India had market power. Second thing is, in terms of diversifying revenue sources, today you have the Saudis, the Qataris, the UAE, these sovereign wealth funds investing in not just Indian refineries, but Indian tech and in other places. You also have, and then you go to the Israeli relationship, which is of long-standing. It was normalized in 1992, but even before that, there was defense and security and intelligence cooperation. India has taken a very similar view to the US on the Israel-Gaza situation. It has not condemned Israel. It will not condemn Israel for, it has in fact condemned, without naming Hamas, the October 7th attack, and said Israel has a right to defend itself. Having said that, even a Modi government that's very Israel-friendly has deep concerns about the way Israel is going about the military operations. Plus, the Modi government has also actually essentially de facto recognized a Palestinian state. Modi was the first Indian prime minister not just to go to Israel, but the first Indian prime minister to go to the West Bank. And so for India, the Middle East is largely a balancing act situation. Iran has actually become the weakest one of those links. Partly because it used to partner with India and Afghanistan. That is no longer necessarily the case. So in some ways, the Iran relationship is in part to continue to engage, to keep that, because there are still things that Iran can do that can either be helpful or harmful to India. And it's really the Israel and the Gulf Arab states that India has really been deepening ties with. That doesn't mean Iran will go away. It's just not as kind of strong a partnership or even a relationship anymore. This is why India, just on the US, India was quite pleased with the Abraham Accords. There were two kind of coalitions that India and the US had formed. One was the India I2U2, clearly a Star Wars fan that named that one, which was the US and India and Israel and UAE. And it was to take advantage of the Abraham Accords, deepen ties, because Israel and India have a lot of technology ties, agricultural cooperation. So they were focusing on things like cybersecurity, food security, technology, more broadly, innovation. And then more recently, just at the G20 meeting in Delhi in September, you had something announced called the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, which was essentially, not an actual corridor, but essentially thinking about trade from India to Europe, which is one of India's largest trading partners, through the Middle East, which would involve Saudis, UAE, and Israel. Bibi Netanyahu even went during the UN General Assembly and highlighted that as something that was happening in the future. These initiatives, or especially this corridor initiative, has been a bit stalled. because of the developments since October 7th. But nobody, I think India and the US want to take it forward when there's a propitious time to do it. But India and the US consult on the Middle East now in a way that they didn't. They used to be on opposite ends, usually. Now they consult. The Indian National Security Advisor was very recently in Israel, probably also talking to, I suspect there was both a readout and probably a pre-brief before as well. And so you are seeing cooperation in ways that were just not possible in different processes. Sometimes it's not together, it's coordinated or it's going in parallel. So Indian Navy has been very active in tackling both pirates and the Houthis. India is not part of Operation Prosperity Guardian, but it is moving in, it's doing kind of how it's operating is actually being helpful. So sometimes you'll see in India that will not join certain coalitions, but it will actually work together in ways that will be helpful.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Ritwik Ghosh and Dr. Tanvi Madan.